Today, we're focusing on Jimmy Iovine's story, and here's why. Jimmy is the co-founder of Interscope Records and Beats, the headphone and streaming company he built with Dr. Dre that Apple later acquired for around $3 billion. He started as a New York recording engineer and producer, working with artists like Bruce Springsteen, Tom Petty, Patti Smith, and U2 before becoming one of the most influential record executives in modern music. For founders and investors, Jimmy's story is all about a few things, including how to spot shifts in culture before the numbers prove them, how to turn a commodity, headphones in this case, into a status symbol, and how to pivot from one declining industry into a new platform without losing your edge. And here's why his story matters to you today. If you're building anything right now, you're living through your own version of what Jimmy lived through. And the reason his story is so useful to you and me is this. His edge isn't luck. It's not genius. It's a repeatable pattern. It's something we can actually study. He uses fear as a tailwind instead of a wall. He redefines his job over and over, from sweeping floors to engineer to producer to label founder to hardware entrepreneur. And here's the thing that really blows my mind about him. He produces the producers. He figures out his superpower is empowering the best people and getting out of their way. We're going to explore all this through the 5 most pivotal moments in Jimmy's career and unpack how you can apply the takeaways in your own business. So let's dive in. Welcome to Inflection Moments. I'm David Franklin, and you and I are about to dive into something fascinating. You know that moment when everything changes for an entrepreneur? When one decision, one pivot, one breakthrough suddenly shifts their entire trajectory. That's what we're hunting for today. If you're building something, if you're that founder grinding it out, making those impossible decisions that keep you up at night, this episode is for you. Because today, we're going inside the mind of one of the most successful entrepreneurs in history to uncover the exact moments that transformed their journey from ordinary to extraordinary. Here's what we're doing. We're dissecting the 5 most pivotal inflection points in their career, but more importantly, we're uncovering the strategic thinking behind each decision, the kind of insight that separates the builders from the dreamers. Ready? Let's get started. Okay, first inflection point, and let's set the scene. We're in early 1970s New York. The music business is going through this massive shift. You're moving away from the old school record label era into something completely different, a studio-driven culture where the studio becomes the instrument. And Record Plant, it's one of the hubs. It's ground zero. Now, John Lennon is in and out of there, Phil Spector is around, and I'm not exaggerating here, literally firing shots in the studio. There's this chaotic, almost dangerous energy in the place. And in the middle of this, Jimmy is a nobody. He's dropped out of John Jay College. He's tried a clothing store job in Brooklyn, and that didn't work out. He's bounced through these random gigs, but here's the thing. He accidentally gets into music. There's this songwriter named Ellie Greenwich who sees something in him, and she gets him his first studio gig. Then he gets fired, but Ellie gets him another shot. And that second job is at Record Plant, and that's the one that matters. So Jimmy's there sweeping floors, he's changing tape reels, he's doing the grunt work. And the whole time, he's absolutely terrified. He says it in his own words himself. He says, when I was younger, I was scared to death. I didn't know where my life was going to go. But here's what's really interesting about Jimmy in that moment. He doesn't want to be wealthy. He doesn't want to be famous. That's not driving him at this point. What he really wants is to be great. And listen to how intense this is. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, I didn't want to be rich. I didn't want to be famous. I didn't even want to be happy. I wanted to be great. I mean, do you feel that? I mean, just saying that out loud, it's just such a different energy that Jimmy's bringing here. For him at that moment, greatness means one thing. Give me a shot, put me on the console, and let me prove that I belong. But here's the problem. Again, Jimmy is terrified. He's got this real deep fear. His internal voice is literally saying, don't hit the ball to me, because he's terrified of messing up in front of real artists. And he's honest about it. He had this real attitude from Brooklyn mixed with huge insecurity. Not a great combination when you're around people at the absolute top of the game. On top of that, the grind is brutal. This isn't glamorous. He's getting fired. He's getting rehired. He's constantly on the edge of being replaced by someone with more experience. And then, Easter Sunday happens. Roy Cicala calls him, and Jimmy knows instantly going in to take that meeting is going to blow up his mom's expectations of what she wants for him. But not going might quietly, permanently kill his shot in the music business. So he chooses leaning into that fear over just staying in his comfort zone. He grabs his coat, he walks past his furious mother, and he heads for Manhattan. When he walks into the record plant, the place is completely dark. The lights are way down. It's moody, smoky, like a movie set. Jimmy can barely see anything. Then the figure at the console turns around and he says, "Hello, James. It's John Lennon." And I absolutely love this moment because it shows you exactly how the world actually works. That Easter call, it wasn't about manning the phones. It's not about being helpful. It was a test. Roy was checking who shows up when it matters. Jimmy passed that test, and John Lennon likes him. But here's where it gets really interesting. A little later, Lennon brings in Elton John to record Whatever Gets You Through the Night. And Jimmy is suddenly the engineer in the studio because his boss doesn't show. So think about that for a second. Jimmy has never recorded Elton John's kind of piano sound before. And now he's got John Lennon and Elton John both staring at him, waiting. He's literally thinking to himself, please don't sit at the piano. Please don't sit at the piano. But Elton walks over, he sits on the piano, and this is where everything changes. This is where Jimmy flips the entire script on how scared he is. He talks about this moment in different interviews, and here's the exact quote that he uses. He says, "I said I want the ball. It was still fear, but it was fear pushing me in the other direction. I started to get high off it." So do you see what he just did? Same emotion, same fear, but he reframed it. He took that fear and decided that it was fuel instead of a stop sign. So what does he actually do? He doesn't overcomplicate things. He's not trying to invent some revolutionary technique. He sets up the mics as best as he knows how. That's it. And here's the key insight he has in that moment. Elton's sound is in Elton's hands. It's in the way he plays the piano. It's not hiding in some magical gadget. Elton finishes the take, he stands up, and he says something like, "That sounds good." And so John Lennon turns to Jimmy and he says, "That's why we use him." That line is massive. This kid, who was terrified he'd be thrown out of the business in disgrace, now has John Lennon, one of the most important musicians in history, validating his instincts. And in that moment, something clicks. He starts forming this idea that would shape his entire career. You don't always need to be the genius. Your job can be something different. Your job can be to create the environment where genius can show up. From that Easter decision and those early sessions with John Lennon, a few massive things happen. He becomes Lennon's go-to assistant and engineer for multiple albums. Walls and Bridges, Rock and Roll, and Pussycats. He gets exposed to Phil Spector's chaos, to Elton John's precision, and to Lennon's work ethic. And Jimmy calls these people his professors. And he talks in particular about his relationship with Bruce Springsteen. He says, "I learned my work ethic from Springsteen. I learned everything about business and music from my time as a second engineer." But the real result, the deeper result, he experiences in his body the idea that fear can be turned into a tailwind. He says it this way: fear's a powerful thing. If you can figure out a way to wrestle that fear, to push you from behind rather than get in your way, you're going to do really well. And that's the first inflection point. That's the moment he realizes his life is not going to be on the docks. That's the moment he decides that fear isn't something to hide from or push away. It's something to lean into. Okay, second inflection point now, and we're going to fast forward a few years into the mid-1970s. Bruce Springsteen is fighting for his life in the music business. His first two albums haven't done what Columbia Records hoped. They're not landing the way that they should. And Born to Run is basically his last shot. This is do or die for him. The recording process for this album is absolutely insane. 14 months of experimentation. 14 months. 6 months spent on just the title track alone. Think about that for a second. Bruce is chasing this epic, massive thing he can hear perfectly in his head, but he can't fully explain it. He can't quite get there. But Jimmy is in the room as a young engineer, first on Born to Run, and then even deeper into Darkness on the Edge of Town. And here's this detail that I love. He's still living with his parents, commuting into these marathon studio sessions. The work is brutal. I'm not exaggerating. Musicians talk about spending entire days, not hours, days, trying to get a single drum sound right. And Jimmy remembers this vividly. They're moving drums into hallways, into elevators, into bathrooms, anywhere. They're chasing this super specific sound, this exact sound that Bruce has locked in his head. And Jimmy, he's exhausted. He's no longer satisfied with just being in the room. He wants to level up. He wants to be the guy artists actually trust when it's life or death. He wants to move from being some anonymous engineer to someone whose fingerprints are on classic records. But at the same time, he's desperate to protect his own sanity. These sessions are pushing him to the absolute edge. And then darkness on the edge of town happens. Jimmy gets put in charge of the drum sound, and weeks go by. Weeks. Bruce keeps saying over and over, I hear the stick hitting the drum. And Jimmy, this is where his Brooklyn attitude comes out. Jimmy snaps back. He says, Bruce, that's because it is a stick hitting a drum. It's not landing, but he's exhausted. And there's this famous story at the time. There's video evidence of Jimmy literally falling asleep at the console, caught on camera dozing off, while Bruce is still saying again, running Thunder Road for 13 hours straight. But Jimmy hits a breaking point. He decides he's done. Listen to what he says about this moment. He says, I was ready to quit. And he's not being poetic. He means it. He feels disrespected, overworked, invisible. And in his Brooklyn brain, the logic is simple. They don't appreciate me, and screw this. So he goes to a guy called John Landau. And John is Bruce's manager and co-producer. Jimmy walks in, he tells John he's quitting, and this is where everything pivots. This is the conversation that changes Jimmy's entire life. John Landau looks at him and he basically says, you have two choices. The first one, you can quit, walk away, you're done. The second one, you can walk back into that studio and tell Bruce one thing. You tell him, I'm here to help you make the best record you can, and I'll support you to the end. And then John adds, and this is everything, this is not about you. This is about the big picture. And Jimmy calls this conversation the greatest advice anyone's ever given me. And he's not being casual. He genuinely means it. He says that this advice alone is the reason he's successful. So Jimmy puts it this way in his own words. He says, I came up with moderate talent, but I had the ability to always see the big picture in the room. Before that conversation, Jimmy's frame was, how am I being treated? What do I get out of this? And am I being respected? But after this conversation, his frame flips completely. He asks himself, what's the big picture here? And how do I serve that? This is not some small shift. It's a fundamental rewiring of how he thinks. So what does Jimmy do? He swallows his pride. He doesn't storm out. He doesn't send an angry email. He walks back into the studio and he tells Bruce, I'm here to support you. Whatever you need, I'm doing it. And Bruce feels that. The relationship deepens and everything changes. And then the results start coming in. Born to Run becomes Bruce's breakthrough. It hits number 3 on the Billboard charts. And suddenly, Bruce Springsteen is a star. It's that album that makes it happen. So naturally, Jimmy gets hired again for Darkness on the Edge of Town and becomes one of Bruce's core creative circle. Not just for that album, for years. And here's where it gets even cooler. Patti Smith hears about this kid. She hears that he can actually hang in these absolutely brutal, crucible level sessions. So she asks him, produce my album, produce Easter. And that's where something magical happens. Bruce has this half-finished song just sitting there, not quite ready to go. And Jimmy begs him, literally begs him to let Patti write the verses and cut it. Bruce agrees to it, they cut it, and it becomes Patti's first hit, Because the Night, number 13 on the Hot 100. But here's what really matters about this inflection point. It's not the commercial results. It's not the albums. Those are amazing, but they're not the point. What matters is what Jimmy internalizes during this period. He walks out of these years with 2 fundamental ideas baked into him, and these ideas shape everything that comes next. The first is put the big picture over your ego. Here's the thing about ego. If you tie your identity to getting credit for each individual decision, you blow up long-term relationships. You become small and fragile. But if you tie your identity to making the work great, if you invest your ego into the big picture, you end up with lifetime allies. People like Bruce Springsteen, Patti Smith, U2, Tom Petty, Dr. Dre, people of that caliber. The second is to produce the producers. Jimmy has this realization. He loves working with people who are already obsessed, already pushing themselves to the limit. His edge isn't trying to replace them or outsmart them. His edge is helping them push their ideas further. And this realization becomes the blueprint for everything he builds later, in particular, his label strategy and his approach to empowering teams. So that's inflection point number 2. It's the moment he stops being the genius in his own movie, and it's the moment he becomes the guy who builds the infrastructure around other geniuses, and he wins bigger because of it. Okay, inflection point number 3, and let's jump forward now. We're in the late 1980s. And at this point, Jimmy has had an absolutely killer run as a producer. He's produced Patti Smith's Easter, Tom Petty's Damn the Torpedoes, and multiple albums after that. Stevie Nicks' Belladonna, U2's Rattle and Hum. He's seen artists at every level of the business. He knows how the machine works from the inside, but he's exhausted, really exhausted. And after that project, something shifts. He starts looking around the industry and thinking, there's more to this than sitting in dark studios for a year and then handing the record to someone else. At the same time, the record industry is in this weird state. Big labels are bureaucratic, slow, defensive, risk averse. The people actually deciding what gets released, they're often not the people who understand what's going on the ground. And they're not connected to where the culture is actually going. And then this happens. A guy named Ted Field, he's an heir, built a film company called Interscope Communications. He wants to start a record label. He has capital, he has ambition, but what he doesn't have is music credibility. He doesn't have Jimmy's talents at this point. U2's manager, Paul McGuinness, introduces them, and David Geffen helps broker the deal. And suddenly, Jimmy is staring at something completely different, not making records in dark rooms anymore, building a record label. So let's get into Jimmy's head for a moment and think about what he wants. He wants control. He wants to control the output. He spent 15 years going into these dark rooms, killing himself to make records great, and then handing them to the record companies that may or may not actually understand them, that may or may not market them right, that may or may not believe in them. He's tired of being one step removed from the outcome. And there's something else happening too. He's starting to feel his age in the studio. This is real. He says it himself. He says, I thought music is going to change. Young bands are not going to be asking for me. But then he adds, and I love this, but I love working with the new thing. I knew I wasn't in that business anymore as a producer. So what he really wants is a structure that lets him do 3 things. The first, stay close to the new thing. Stay close to connected to what's happening. The second is to make the calls on what gets supported and what doesn't. And the third is empower other producers the way he wished someone had empowered him earlier in his career. But here's the problem. Producers starting record labels, historically, that's been a bad idea. By 1990, there's basically a graveyard of failed vanity labels. Brilliant creative people who had no idea how to scale a business, no idea how to navigate corporate relationships, and no idea how to build lasting institutions. Interscope is also launching in a crowded field of new labels. A lot of people in the industry are looking at this and thinking, a guy from outside plus a record producer, those 2 elements are not likely to succeed. There's also real financial and reputational risk here. Ted Field is using something like $15 to $20 million of his own inheritance to seed this thing, his own money. And Jimmy is risking his reputation. If Interscope implodes, he's not just a producer who had a bad album, he's the guy whose label blew up. And on top of that, and this matters, Jimmy doesn't come from money. He's the son of a longshoreman. The corporate side is not familiar territory. He's about to walk into boardrooms with Time Warner execs, MCA, Universal, people who speak a completely different language. So here's what happens. Jimmy makes a strategic decision about his own identity. He decides his edge as a label head is going to be exactly the same as his edge as a producer. Empathy and instinct. And with these ideas in mind, he structures Interscope differently than the old guard labels. A&R gets real power. Artists get creative control. Producers get creative control. The label operates, and I love this phrase, like a heat-seeking missile for shifts in culture. Jimmy knows he's not the guy who's going to manufacture pop acts through committee. He's not going to sit in conference rooms and decide by spreadsheet what the market wants. He wants the weird stuff, the edgy stuff, the things that other labels are afraid of. And pretty quickly, Jimmy proves that the model works fast. In less than 3 years, the label is profitable. Early signings give them hits across multiple genres. It's working. But then they make the move that really defines Interscope's entire identity and destiny. They make a distribution deal with Death Row Records. For context here, in 1992, Interscope acquires the rights to market and distribute Death Row's releases. Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Tupac Shakur, and suddenly, Interscope isn't just a label anymore. They're at the absolute center of the gangster rap explosion. And they're also at the center of a political firestorm. Lyrics, violence, free speech debates, Congress. Politicians like Bob Dole are literally naming Interscope as an example of cultural decay. Time Warner, which owns half of Interscope at this point, is getting absolutely hammered in the press, in the halls of Congress, and by shareholders. Most corporate parents would fold immediately. Most would say, we're done, we're out, we need to protect the brand. And eventually, Time Warner does bail. They sell their stake back to Jimmy and Ted for about $150 million just to get out of the situation. But Jimmy doesn't back down, and he doubles down on the music. In Jimmy's own words, here's what he says about Death Row. Nobody wanted to be in business with Death Row because they felt that there was an element there that could be dangerous. But I just knew they had great music and that they were a bunch of guys who wanted to make out the ghetto. That's something I can understand. And you see what he's doing? He's using the John Landau lesson again. This is not about you. It's not about Time Warner's comfort. It's not about what's politically convenient. It's about the big picture of where culture is going. And the results are massive. Interscope becomes, and this is a direct quote, the most successful new label to arrive on the scene since Geffen. They're doing hundreds of millions in sales in their first years. MCA, later Universal, buys 50% of the label for around $200 million in 96. Jimmy and Ted get a huge financial win and creative control. Under Jimmy, Interscope builds a roster that's insane. 9 Inch Nails, No Doubt, Marilyn Manson, Eminem, 50 Cent, Black Eyed Peas, Lady Gaga. And during this time, Jimmy moves from being a producer to being chairman and CEO of an entire major label group, Interscope, Geffen A&M, and he stays in that seat until 2014. But here's what really matters about this inflection point. It's not just that he made a ton of money. That's not the point. What matters is that he proves you can scale producer thinking into an entire institution. You can run a label the way a great producer runs a session, serve the artist, produce for better songs, insist on quality, and trust your ear over corporate fear. And that's inflection point number 3. That's the moment he stops making individual hits. Instead, it's the moment he starts building the machine that makes hits. Okay, inflection point number 4, and we're in the early 90s. And this is where things get serious. Gangster rap is exploding. NWA has already changed the game completely. Dr. Dre leaves NWA, partners with Suge Knight, and forms Death Row Records. And the sound of the Chronic, it's about to redefine hip-hop entirely. But from the corporate side, from Time Warner's perspective, this is a nightmare. The lyrics are explicit, the imagery is violent, politicians are literally holding press conferences about this music. It's a total PR disaster. Time Warner want nothing to do with it. And Jimmy, he's in an interesting spot at this moment. He's exhausted after Rattle and Hum with U2. And here's the honest part. He doesn't really understand hip-hop yet. And he admits this. He says, I knew hip-hop was going around, but I had no idea what it was before Dre walked in with the Chronic. So let's get into Jimmy's head for a moment. What he wants is a new energy. He wants to be at the center of whatever is going to define the next decade. He wants Interscope to be the place where the most important artists go, even if that terrifies the establishment. And on a human level, there's something else happening. He wants to bet on people who remind him of himself, a kid from nowhere trying to get out of a rough environment. And Dre is that same energy. The only difference here is that he comes from Compton instead of Brooklyn. Now, again, there are challenges everywhere in this situation. As we've already explored, Time Warner is getting absolutely hammered. Shareholder fights, news stories, activist lawsuits about gangster rap, and Interscope's relationship with Death Row, that's about to be the lightning rod for all of it. And the other execs, they're telling Jimmy this is way too risky. They're pressuring him hard. Later, when Dre wants to leave Death Row and start his own record called Aftermath, execs lean on Jimmy even harder. According to Jimmy's account of this, when execs pressured him to drop Dre, Jimmy made clear his loyalty. He said if Dre went, then he would go too. And Jimmy talks about this in his own words. He says, we could cut Dre loose, but then you'd have to save my salary as well, because I'm going with him. That's not a negotiation. That is a clear statement of loyalty. That's clarity about where Jimmy's priorities are. But there's also some internal challenges here. The environment around Death Row is genuinely dangerous. Engineers are getting roughed up. There are guns in studios, constant tension. This isn't some metaphorical struggle or anything. It's real physical danger. And then, after Dre leaves Death Row in 96 and starts Aftermath, the first compilation, Dr. Dre Presents The Aftermath, underperforms. There are rumors that the label's in trouble, and there are people wondering if Jimmy has made a huge mistake. Remember, Jimmy is staking his entire reputation on someone operating in a world he doesn't fully understand, in a genre that makes his corporate partners deeply uncomfortable. That's a lot of risk. So here's what happens. Jimmy stops thinking like a rock producer who dabbles in hip hop, and instead he becomes something different, a strategic partner to Dre. And in particular, he does a few things. First, and we explored this in the previous inflection point, he structures Death Row as a distribution and marketing deal through Interscope. Not a merger, not a takeover, because that creates some insulation while still capturing the upside. Second, when Time Warner bails, when they literally sell their stake back, Jimmy and Ted buy it back, and they turn around and sell half the company to MCA and Universal for more money. So they get financial independence and they keep the Death Row pipeline intact. And third, when Dre leaves Death Row, Jimmy backs him completely. They position Aftermath as a quality over quantity boutique label under the Interscope umbrella. But most critically, and this is where it gets interesting, he doubles down on talent scouting through Dre's ears. In 98, Interscope gets a copy of Eminem's Slim Shady EP. Jimmy plays it for Dre in his garage. Dre listens, and he says one thing: find him. Now. That's it. That single moment, that collaboration between Jimmy's institutional power and Dre's ear, that leads to the Slim Shady LP, then the Marshall Mathers LP, and a run that completely redefines what a superstar rapper can be. Now, Jimmy's not making beats. He's not rapping. He's not discovering Eminem on his own. His job is different. It's to hold the institutional nerve, to fight the corporate wars, to give Dre the room and the resources to build. That is producing the producers. That's the big picture. So what are the results out of all this? The Chronic and Snoop's Doggy Style turned gangster rap into a mainstream commercial force. We're talking millions of albums sold. The Death Row partnership turned Interscope into a central player in 1990s hip hop, and the label survives the entire political firestorm. Aftermath signs Eminem, we get the Slim Shady LP, the Marshall Mathers LP, tens of millions of copies sold. Eminem becomes a superstar in a way nobody predicted. 50 Cent's Get Rich or Die Tryin', released through Interscope, Shady Records and Aftermath, sells over 9 million copies in the US alone. It becomes the top selling album of 2003. And putting this all together, financially, this cements Interscope as an absolute juggernaut in the Universal system. But strategically, it proves something fundamental about how Jimmy thinks, which is the riskiest cultural bets often become the biggest franchises if you back the right people and protect them from corporate panic. That's inflection point number 4. It's the moment Jimmy chooses to ride the scariest wave in the entire industry, and then he learns to surf it without drowning. Okay, final inflection point now, and we're in the early 2000s. And this is when things get apocalyptic for the music industry. Napster has gutted the business. Physical sales are collapsing. Labels are literally suing college kids. It's ugly and it's desperate. But Jimmy sees something that a lot of his peers completely miss. The moment he sees Napster, he has this moment of clarity. He says he knows instantly the record industry is toast. Not in 5 years, not eventually. It's toast right now. And he realizes something crucial. Record companies won't even exist without technology, without figuring out how to work with tech instead of against it. So he starts spending a lot of time with Steve Jobs, with Eddie Q, helping them with iTunes, marketing U2 through Apple, learning how tech and music could actually work together. And Steve Jobs just blows his mind. Jimmy says it this way: how Sony missed this is completely mind-boggling to me. A historic fuck up. That is not casual criticism. That's watching a company's entire strategy collapse in real time. But even with Steve Jobs, even with Apple, Jimmy is frustrated. He spends 3 years trying to convince Steve Jobs to do subscription streaming. He knows it's inevitable. He can see where this is going. But Steve just doesn't want to pay the labels what it would cost. He wants iTunes to work on a la carte. One song, 99 cents, done. Jimmy knows that's not the answer. The industry is in denial, and he's stuck watching this play out. So getting into Jimmy's head for a moment and thinking about what he wants, it's not about records anymore. It's not even about individual artists. It's about saving the value of music itself. He sees what piracy has done. It's conditioned people to see music as free, not cheap, free. The iPod has made music mobile. That's amazing, but the listening experience is emotionally dead. Those earbuds, they're technically fine, but soulless. And artists, they're getting crushed economically. The entire system is collapsing. So he wants to build something that does three things. The first, he wants to make listening feel special again and make it feel like something worth paying for. The second is that he wants to give artists in the industry a new revenue stream outside of syncing record sales. And third is that he wants to position himself at this intersection of culture and technology, the place where the future actually lives. But there are structural challenges facing Jimmy at this point. They're everywhere. The old record model is broken. Labels are putting out fires from the past in court instead of building the business for the future. Tech companies, aside from Apple, mostly see music as a feature, not a core business, not something to invest in. And there's another problem. Jimmy is a label head, a music guy. He has zero experience manufacturing electronics, hardware margins, supply chains, retail distribution. That is a completely different game. That's where he could fail spectacularly. And even worse, Dre is thinking about something completely different. Dre's lawyer is pushing him towards a sneaker line, a sneaker brand. It's easy to understand, it's lifestyle, and it's natural for someone of Dre's stature. Meanwhile, Jimmy thinks that's a terrible idea. But here's where the pivot happens. It's literally a walk on the beach. In 2006, Jimmy and Dre are walking along the Pacific, and Dre says, "My lawyer wants to sell me sneakers. I've got an offer from a major company." And Jimmy immediately says, "Dre, nobody cares what speakers you wear. You're about audio. People will buy the audio you recommend. Forget sneakers and let's make speakers." That's it. That's the entire pivot. And they lock in on something simple but powerful. The iPod made music mobile. That's huge. But the listening experience is still weak. Headphones are what they call a medical experiment, sterile, boring, and no personality. Instead, people want headphones that feel like Axl Rose, like Tupac, gear with personality, and gear that matches the music. So they partner with Robert Brunner and Ammunition for design, and Monster Cable for manufacturing and distribution. Dre tests the prototype using 50 cents in the club, and he tunes them for bass, heavy bass, the Beats curve, deliberately aimed at a young, hip-hop driven audience. And then Jimmy's marketing brain kicks in. He floods music videos, NBA sidelines, pop culture, everywhere. Artists become co-marketers, co-investors. This is the Interscope thinking applied to hardware. Put the product in the hands of the coolest people, then let culture do the rest. Later, they realize that distribution alone isn't enough and they need a service. So they launch Beats Music, a subscription streaming app built around human curation at a time when everyone else is pushing pure algorithms, human beings picking songs, creating playlists, and adding context. So the result of all this, in 7 or 8 years, Beats goes from being an idea on a beach to a multi-billion-dollar exit. Beats Electronics becomes the listening premium headphone brand for an entire generation, especially among younger listeners. Beats Music proves, and this is critical, proves that there's an appetite for a curated streaming service, and it proves that free isn't the only path. And then in 2014, Apple buys Beats Electronics and Beats Music for $3 billion, $2.6 billion in cash, and $400 million in stock. It's the largest acquisition in Apple's history. And Jimmy and Dre join Apple as execs. For Apple, this fills two gaps they had. First, they now have a culturally hot audio hardware brand, something that means something to younger people. And second, they now have a streaming team that actually understands both artists and technology, people who speak both languages. For Jimmy, this is his fourth major reinvention. He goes from engineer to producer to label mogul to hardware and streaming entrepreneur, and now Apple executive. And then, barely a year later, he helps shepherd the launch of Apple Music in 2015. He becomes the key negotiator with every label, every artist, and he pushes the idea that he had in those conversations with Steve Jobs, paid streaming. Artists get compensated. And he's public about it. He attacks free tiers. He says, "We believe artists should get paid. That's why I went to Apple." And that is Jimmy's final inflection point. It's the moment that Jimmy accepts that the record business as he knew it The business that defined his entire career is completely over. And instead of clinging to it, instead of defending it, he builds the next layer on top of it. Okay, let's step back here for a second. We just walked through 5 completely different moments: a dark studio with John Lennon, a brutal grind with Bruce Springsteen, a boardroom bet on Interscope, the chaos of Death Row, and a beach walk that became Beats. On the surface, they're totally different stories. But underneath all of it, the same patterns keep repeating. And I think this is where you and I need to really pay attention, because this is where the useful stuff lives. Here's what really seems to be going on in his life. There are 5 threads that run through everything. The first is that he uses fear as a feature and not a bug. Jimmy is brutally honest about this. He was driven by fear and insecurity when he was young, real fear. But here's the key. It's not about having fear. It's about what he does with it. When he's scared as a young assistant, his instinct is don't hit the ball to me. Stay small, hide, and don't fail in public. But then the Lennon sessions happen and something flips. He says, I want the ball. It was still fear, but it was fear pushing me in the other direction, and I started to get high off it. Same emotion, same fear, different direction. And you see this pattern repeat over and over. Going in on Easter Sunday against his family's wishes, walking back into Springsteen's studio instead of quitting, signing Death Row when everyone else runs away, starting a hardware company in his 50s when his peers are retiring, trying to convince Steve Jobs to do subscription streaming when the whole industry thinks iTunes is fine. If you're building something, this is the pattern that matters. When the fear spikes, he doesn't tap out, he uses it as a compass. The second common thread here is that Jimmy realizes this is not about him, and he uses service as a strategy. That conversation that Jimmy had with John Landau when they were recording Bruce Springsteen's Darkness on the Edge of Town, that is the philosophical core of everything that comes after. This is not about you. This is about the big picture. Jimmy internalizes that as the project, the artist, the long-term relationship. Those are the big picture. And your feelings, your desire for credit, your need to be the smartest person in the room, that's small picture. And then he builds his entire career on that principle. As a producer, your job is to take the idea and add to the emotion. A huge part of producing is empathy and service. As a label head, his mantra becomes, you need 3 more songs, pushing artists for quality, but always in service of making their albums undeniable. With Dre, he treats him as a partner, not a subordinate. When execs tell him to drop Dre, he says, if Dre goes, I go. That's loyalty in service of the bigger bet. With Beats, he doesn't pretend he's the designer or the sound guy. He brings in experts for that. Then he frames the entire project in a way that lets them win. So here's the big takeaway for founders. Service isn't just a moral stance. It's an incredible strategic stance. It makes the best people want to work with you for decades. The third common thread is that Jimmy produces the producers. Jimmy's edge is not doing the thing himself. His edge is finding the people who are best at the thing and amplifying them. He literally calls Lennon, Springsteen, and Patti Smith his professors. He says, these incredible people allow me into their lives. I learned my work ethic from watching Springsteen. And later, he does the exact same thing with Dre, with Gwen Stefani, Eminem, Lady Gaga. He spots their potential. He gives them resources. He protects their creative process. And the phrase that keeps coming up is that he produces the producers. He gives them space, real space, but he also pushes them. In his own words, he says, I would just push it until the person couldn't take it anymore, and then go one step further. If you're building a team, this is the move. Stop trying to be the star. Become the person stars want in their corner. The fourth common thread is reinventing yourself as a habit, not as a crisis. Jimmy is unusually proud of how many times he's changed lanes. Listen to what he says. He says, the proudest thing in my career is that I was able to change it 3 times. I couldn't have done the same thing my whole life. I would have gone nuts. Again, thinking about these pivots out loud, he goes from student engineer to producer to label founder, label mogul to hardware and streaming entrepreneur, and finally, entrepreneur to education builder. But here's the crucial thing. He doesn't wait until he's irrelevant. He leaves the studio while he's producing U2, still hot. He starts Beats while he's still running Interscope, still powerful. And the through line here is this belief that not every industry was made to last forever. He hears an Intel exec say that about the record business, and instead of denying it, instead of defending the old world, he accepts it and pivots. And the fifth and final common thread here is to stand at the intersection of culture and technology. From iTunes to Beats to Apple Music, Jimmy keeps putting himself at intersections. And just to name a few here, the first is music and technology. He realizes early that record companies will live or die based on how they partner with technology. That leads him to Steve Jobs, to Apple, and to Beats. The second is the intersection between art and business. He built Interscope as a place where creative weirdos and hardcore business people can actually ship things that work. And the third one is this intersection between education and industry. He and Dre donate $70 million to start the Iovine and Young Academy at USC to train students who can operate across design, engineering, and entrepreneurship. Jimmy is obsessed with bridging worlds together. He literally complains that tech is inept at popular culture and media is inept at tech. And he basically spends his entire life trying to fix that gap. So if you zoom way out, the pattern looks like this. He starts in a narrow lane in engineering and he keeps zooming out to bigger systems, production, labels, devices, platforms, education. And at each level, at every level, he uses the same core skills: reading people, reading the room, embracing fear, and betting on the right collaborators. That's not luck. It's not genius. It's a repeatable system. Okay, so here's what keeps coming back to me about Jimmy Iovine's story. It's not a story about genius. It's not about a virtuoso, and it's not about someone with a rare gift that nobody else has. It's a story about someone who started by sweeping floors, someone who had moderate talent, someone who admits that himself, and somehow he built an insane career by mastering one specific skill: how to stand next to greatness. So here's the thread that connects everything. If you can learn to do three things, if you can master these three things, you give yourself permission to reinvent again and again, no matter how much the game changes. The first, turn fear into a tailwind instead of a wall. The second, make it genuinely not about you. Make it about the big picture. And third, invest your ego in that big picture instead of each individual decision. That's the formula. That's how you get permission to reinvent. Because Jimmy's life is basically a series of moments where a lot of people would have said, I'm out. Leaving his family at Easter, staying with Springsteen when his ego was screaming to quit, hitching his wagon to the most controversial label in America, betting on a white rapper from Detroit when nobody understood it, and starting a hardware company when everyone thought that physical music was dead. And then walking into Apple and saying, streaming has to be paid. Artists have to get compensated, while free tiers were winning everywhere. He keeps choosing the harder path. And then here's the thing. He keeps building systems that make that path pay off. These are the lessons that turn Jimmy Iovine from ordinary to extraordinary, and you can use them in your own business. Thanks for listening. We'll talk soon. Thank you for joining us on Inflection Moments. If today's story sparked a new perspective or challenged your thinking, be sure to share it with someone you know loves this stuff as much as you and I do. Maybe it's a college buddy, your water cooler buddy, or maybe even someone in the family group chat. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to our channels so you can be the first one to hear what we've got coming next. And if you're interested in insights, ideas, and lessons from some of the world's greatest entrepreneurs, sign up for our newsletter. The link is in the show notes. Until next time, keep building and talk soon.